was streaking at fantastic speeds through a multicolored tunnel of some kind. Fully conscious, I wondered why I had no fear, for what I really felt was a sense of recognition and contentment and peace, as though I had been here before. When the movement stopped, I found myself in an environment of warm, white light. Will was standing to my left and slightly behind me. "There you are," he said, smiling at me. His lips weren't moving, but I could clearly hear his voice. I then noticed the appearance of his body. He seemed to be completely illuminated from within. I reached over to touch his hand, and noticed that my body appeared the same way. When I touched him, what I felt was a field, several inches outside the arm I could see. Pushing harder, I realized I couldn't penetrate this energy. I only moved his body away from me. Will was near bursting with mirth. In fact, his expression was so humorous that I laughed myself. "Amazing, isn't it?" he asked. "This is a higher vibration than at the Celestine ruins," I replied. "Do you know where we are?" Will was silent, gazing out at our surroundings. We seemed to be in an environment that was spatial, and we had a sense of up and down, but we were suspended, motionless in midair, and there were no horizons. White light was a constant hue in all directions. Finally, Will said, "This is an observation point. I came here briefly when I had imaged your face. Other souls were here." "What were they doing?" "Observing people who had come over after death." "What? You mean this is where people come right after they have died?" "Yes." "Why are we here? Has something happened to Charlene?" He turned more directly toward me. "No, I don't think so. Remember what happened to me when I began to image you? I moved to many locations before we finally met at the falls. There's probably something we need to see here before we can find Charlene. Let's wait and see what happens with these souls." He nodded to our left, where several human-like entities were materializing directly in front of us, at a distance of what appeared to be about 30 feet. As the entities formed completely, I remained cautious, but eventually I felt a loving and supportive energy emanating from their bodies, which seemed to be comprised of a whitish amber light that danced and shimmered in and out of focus. Their faces had human characteristics, but could not be looked at directly. I couldn't even tell how many souls were there. At one moment, 3 or 4 seemed to be facing us. Then I would blink and there would be 6, then 3 again, all dancing in and out of view. Overall, they looked like a flickering, animated cloud of amber against the background color of white. After several minutes, another form began to materialize beside the others. Only this figure was more clearly in focus and appeared in a luminous body similar to Will and myself. We could see that it was a middle-aged man. He looked around wildly, then saw the group of souls and began to relax. To my surprise, when I focused closely on him, I could pick up on what he was feeling and thinking. I glanced at Will, who nodded that he was also sensing the person's reaction. I focused again and observed that, in spite of a certain detachment and a sense of love and support, he was in a state of shock at having discovered he had died. Only minutes before he had been routinely jogging, and while attempting to run up a long hill, had suffered a massive heart attack. The pain had lasted only a few seconds, and then, suddenly, he was hovering outside his body, watching a stream of bystanders rush up to help him. He had called out for help, and had instantly found himself in a tunnel of colors that had brought him to where he now stood. As we watched, he seemed to become more aware of the souls and moved toward them, shifting out of focus to us, appearing more like them. Then, abruptly, he pulled back toward us and was quickly surrounded by an office of some kind, filled with computers and wall charts and people working. Everything looked perfectly real, except the walls were semi-transparent so that we could see what was happening inside, and the sky above the office was not blue, but a strange olive color. "He's deluding himself," Will said. "He's recreating the office where he worked on Earth, trying to pretend he hasn't died." The entities moved closer, and others came, until there were dozens of them, all flickering in and out of focus in the amber light. They seemed to be sending the man love and some kind of information I couldn't understand. Gradually, the constructed office began to fade and eventually disappeared completely. The man was left with an expression of resignation on his face, and he again moved into focus with the entities. "Let's go with them," I heard Will say. At the same moment I felt his arm, or rather the energy of his arm, pushing against my back. As soon as I inwardly agreed, there was the slight sensation of movement, and the entities and the man all came into clearer focus. The entities now had glowing faces much like Will and I, but their hands and feet, instead of being clearly formed, were mere radiations of light. I could now focus on the entities for as long as 4 or 5 seconds before losing them and having to blink to find them again. I became aware that the group of souls, as well as the deceased individual, were watching an intense point of bright light moving toward us. It eventually swelled into a massive beam that covered everything. Unable to look directly at the light, I turned so I could just see the silhouette of the man, who was staring fully at the beam without apparent difficulty. Again, I could pick up on his thoughts and emotions. The light was filling him with an unimaginable sense of love and calm perspective. As this sensation swept over him, his viewpoint and knowledge expanded until he could clearly see the life he had just lived from a broad and amazingly detailed perspective. Immediately, he could see the circumstances of his birth and early family life. He was born John Donald Williams, to a father who was slow intellectually, and to a mother who was extremely detached and absent because of her involvement in various social events. As a result, he had grown up angry and defiant, an interrogator, eager to prove to the world that he was a brilliant achiever that could master science and mathematics. He earned a doctorate in physics at MIT at 23 and taught at 4 prestigious universities before moving on to the Defense Department and later to a private energy corporation. Clearly, he had thrown himself into this later position with total abandon and disregard for his health. After years of fast foods and no exercise, he was diagnosed with a chronic heart condition. An exercise routine pursued too aggressively had proved fatal. He died in his prime, at age 58. At this point, William's awareness shifted, and he began to have profound regrets and severe emotional pain concerning the way he had led his life. He realized that his childhood and early family had been set up perfectly to expose what was already his soul's tendency to use defiance and elitism to feel more important. His main tool had been ridicule, putting down others by criticizing their abilities and work ethics and personality. Yet now he could see that all the teachers had been in place to help him overcome this insecurity. All of them had arrived at just the right time to show him another way, but he had ignored them completely. Instead, he had just pursued his tunnel vision to the end. All the signs had been there to choose his work more carefully, to slow down. There were a multitude of implications and dangers inherent in his research that he had failed to consider. He had allowed his employers to feed him new theories and even unfamiliar physical principles without even questioning their origin. These procedures worked, and that was all he cared about, because they led to success, gratitude, recognition. He had succumbed to his need for recognition. Again. My God, he thought, I failed just as I did before. His mind abruptly shifted to a new scene, an earlier existence. He was in the southern Appalachians. It was the 19th century, a military outpost. In a large tent, several men leaned over a map. Lanterns flickered their light against the walls. A consensus had been reached among all the field officers present. There was no hope for peace now. War was inevitable, and sound military principles dictated an attack quickly. As one of the commanding general's top 2 aides, Williams had been forced to concur with the others. No other choice existed, he had concluded. Disagreement would have ended his career. Besides, he couldn't have dissuaded the others even if he had wanted to. The offensive would have to be carried out, likely the last major battle in the Eastern War against the natives. A sentry interrupted with a communication for the general. A settler wanted to see the commander immediately. Looking through the open tent flap, Williams had seen the frail white woman, perhaps 30, desperation in her eyes. He found out later that she was the daughter of a missionary, bringing word of a possible new Native American initiative for peace, an appeal that she personally had negotiated at great risk. But the general had refused to see her, remaining in the tent as she shouted at him, finally ordering her from his camp at gunpoint, not knowing the content of her message, not wanting to know. Again, Williams kept quiet. Williams knew that a war would greatly please the railroad and coal tycoons and the newly emerging oil interests, and would, of course, ensure his own future as well. All he had to do was to keep his mouth shut and play along. And he would, under silent protest, unlike the general's other primary aide. He remembered looking across the room at his colleague, a small man who limped slightly. This man, like the general and other controllers, feared the Native Americans and wanted them removed, not just because of their ferocity at war or the strength of their numbers, not even because of their alienation to the expanding industrial economy that was poised to overrun their lands. They feared the natives because of something deeper, some terrifying and transformative idea, known in its entirety only by a few elders, but which bubbled up through their culture and called out for the controllers to change, to remember another vision. As we watched, William's recollection shifted to a gorge in the deep woods, site of the coming battle. Cavalry poured over a ridge in a surprise offensive. The Native Americans rose to the defense, ambushing the cavalry from the bluffs on either side. A short distance away, a large man and a woman huddled among the rocks. The man was a young academic, an observer of some kind, terrified he was this close to a battle. It was wrong, all wrong. His interest was economics. He knew nothing of violence. The woman beside him in the rocks was the young missionary seen at the military tent earlier. At this moment she felt abandoned, betrayed. Her effort could have worked, she knew, if those with the power had listened to what was possible. But she would not give up, she had told herself, not until the violence stopped. She kept saying, "It can be healed, it can be healed." Suddenly, on the downslope behind them, 2 cavalrymen rode hard toward a single native chief. I strained to see who it was, finally recognizing the man as the angry chief who had been so vocal against the white woman's ideas. As I watched, he turned quickly and shot an arrow into the chest of one of his pursuers. The other soldier leaped from his horse and fell upon the Native American. Both struggled furiously, the soldier's knife finally plunging deep into the throat of the darker man. Blood gushed across the torn ground. At this point, William's focus drifted to a hill which overlooked the entire scene. Another individual was looking down on the battle. He was dressed in buckskins and led a pack mule, a mountain man. He turned from the battle and walked down the hill in the opposite direction, past the pool and falls, then out of sight. I was astounded. The battle took place right here in the valley, just south of the falls. When my attention returned to Williams, he was reliving the horror of the bloodshed and the hatred. He knew his failure to act during the Native American wars had set up the conditions and hopes of his most recent life. But just as before, he had failed to take action, failed to awaken. He had been together again with a large man who had been killed with a woman missionary, and Williams knew that he was supposed to remember first, and then help his younger friend to awaken. He saw them standing together on a hill, discussing the process. They were supposed to find 5 others in the valley, forming a group of 7. Together the group was to help resolve the fear. The idea seemed to thrust him into a deeper recollection. Fear had been the great enemy throughout humanity's long and tortuous history. And he seemed to know that present human culture was polarizing, giving the controllers in this historical time one last opportunity to seize power, to exploit the new technologies for their own purpose. He seemed to cringe in agony. He knew that it was tremendously important for his group to come together, regardless of whether he could be there. History was poised for such groups, and only if enough of them formed, and only if enough of them understood the fear could the polarization be dispelled and the experiments in the valley ended. Very slowly I became aware that I was again in the place of soft white light. William's visions had ended, and both he and the other entities had quickly vanished. Afterward, I had experienced a quick movement backward that had left me dizzy and distracted. I noticed Will beside me to the right. "What happened?" I asked. "Where did he go?" "I'm not sure," he replied. "What was happening to him?" "He was experiencing a life review." "Are you aware of what that is?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I know that people who have had near-death experiences often report that their whole lives flash before them. Is that what you mean?" "Yes, but the increased awareness of this review process is having a great impact on human culture. It's another part of the higher perspective provided by knowledge of the afterlife. Thousands of people have had near-death experiences, and as their stories are shared and talked about, the reality of the life review is becoming part of our cultural reality. This knowledge is contributing to our determination to pursue every intuitive image that comes to mind and keep it firmly in awareness. We're living life in a more deliberate way. We don't want to miss a single important event. We don't want the pain of looking back later and realizing that we blew it, that we failed to make the right decisions or actions." Suddenly Will paused and cocked his head as though hearing something. Immediately I felt another jolt in my solar plexus and heard the dissonant hum again. Moments later, the sound faded. Will was looking around. The solid white environment was shimmering with intermittent streaks of dull gray. "Whatever is going on is affecting this dimension too," he said. "I don't know if we can maintain our vibration." As we waited, the dull streaks gradually diminished, and the solid white background returned. "Remember the warning about new technology in the Ninth Insight," Will added, "and what William said about those in fear of trying to control this technology." "What about this group of 7 coming back?" I asked. "And those visions that Williams was having of this valley in the 19th century?" "Will, I've seen them too." "What do you think that means?" Will's expression grew more serious. "I think all this is what we're supposed to be seeing. And I think you are part of this group." Suddenly the hum began to increase again. "William said we first had to understand this fear," Will stressed, "in order to help resolve it. That's what we have to do next. We have to find a way to understand this fear." Will had barely finished his thought when an ear-shattering sound tore through my body, pushing me backward. Will reached out for me, his face distorted and out of focus. I tried to grab his arm, but he was suddenly gone, and I was falling downward, out of control, amid a panorama of colors. Shaking off the vertigo, I became aware that I was back at the falls. Across from me, under a rocky overhang, was my pack, lying exactly where I had placed it earlier. I looked around. No sign of Will. What had happened? Where did he go? According to my watch, less than an hour had passed since Will and I had entered the other dimension. And as I thought about my experience, I was struck with how much love and calm I had felt, and how little anxiety until now. Now everything around me seemed dull and muted. Wearily, I walked over and picked up my pack, fear welling up in my stomach. Sensing too much exposure in the openness of the rocks, I decided to walk back into the hills to the south until I could decide what to do. When I had crested the first hill and started down the slope, I spotted a small man, perhaps 50 years old, walking up to my left. He had red hair and a thin goatee and wore hiking clothes. Before I could hide, he spotted me and headed straight my way. When he reached me, he smiled cautiously and said, "I'm afraid I'm turned around a bit. Could you direct me back to town?" I gave him the general directions south to the spring and then on to the main stream, which he could follow west to the ranger station. He appeared relieved. "I ran into someone east of here earlier who told me how to get back, but I must have made a wrong turn. Are you also heading toward town? Looking closely at the expression on his face, I seemed to pick up a sadness and anger in his personality. I don't think so, I said. I'm looking for a friend who's out here somewhere. What did the person you met look like? It was a woman with blonde hair and bright eyes, he replied. I didn't catch her name. As friendly as possible, I said, It sounds as if the person you met could have been my friend. Where did you see her exactly? He pointed toward the south and told me he had run into her about half a mile back. She had been walking alone and had headed southeast from there. I'll walk with you as far as the spring, I said. I picked up my pack, and as we walked down the hill, he asked, If that was your friend, where did you think she was going? I don't know. Into some mystical space, perhaps, looking for utopia? He was smiling cynically. I realized he was baiting me. Maybe, I said. Don't you believe in the possibility of utopia? No, of course not. It's Neolithic thinking, naive. I glanced at him, fatigue beginning to overwhelm me, trying to end the conversation. Just a difference of opinion, I guess. He laughed. No, it's a fact. There's no utopia coming. Everything's getting worse out there, not better. Economically, things are swinging out of control, and eventually it will explode. Why do you say that? It's simple demographics. For most of this century, there's been a large middle class in the Western countries, a class who have promoted order and reason, and carried a general faith that the economic system could work for everyone. But this faith is beginning to collapse now. You can see it everywhere. Fewer people every day now believe in the system, or play by the rules. And it's all because the middle class is shrinking. Technological development is making labor valueless and splitting human culture into two groups, the haves and the have-nots, those who have investments and ownership in the economy, and those who are restricted to menial service jobs. Couple this with the failure of education, and you can see the scope of the problem. I stopped on the crest of one of the hills to view the impending sunset, and our eyes met. He seemed to realize he had gotten carried away with his tirade, and in that moment he began to look deeply familiar to me. I told him my name, and he responded with his, Joel Lipscomb. We looked at each other for another long moment, but he offered no indication that he knew me. Why had we met in this valley? As soon as I had formulated that last question in my mind, I knew the answer. He was voicing the vision of fear that Williams had mentioned. A chill ran through me. This was supposed to happen. I looked at him with a new seriousness. Do you really think things are that bad? Yes, absolutely, he replied. I'm a journalist, and you can see this attitude playing out in our profession. In the past, we at least attempted to do our job with certain standards of integrity. But no longer. It's all hype and sensationalism. No one's looking for the truth anymore, or trying to present it in the most accurate way. Journalists are looking for the scoop, the most outrageous perspective, every bit of dirt they can dig up. Pretty soon all these subtle assumptions and agreements that hold civilization together will be totally subverted. Think what will happen once unemployment gets to a certain level in the inner cities. Crime's out of control now. What's going to stop it? He paused, and I glanced back at him as we walked. I guess you think some spiritual renaissance is going to change all this, he asked. I sure hope so. He struggled over a fallen tree to catch up with me. Listen, he continued, I bought into this spirituality stuff for a while, this idea of purpose and destiny and insights. I could even see some interesting coincidences happening in my own life. But I decided it was all crazy. The human mind can imagine all sorts of silly things. We don't even realize we're doing it. When you get right down to it, all this talk of spirituality is just weird rhetoric. I started to counter his argument, but changed my mind. My intuition was to hear him out first. Yeah, I said, I guess it sometimes sounds that way. You probably think something mystical's happening here in this valley, and why not? Everyone would love for there to be something mystical going on in existence, especially considering the diminishing quality of life. But the fact is, there's nothing going on. We're just animals, Creatures unlucky enough and smart enough to have figured out we're alive, and we're going to die, without ever knowing any purpose. We can pretend all we want, and we can wish all we want, but that basic existential fact remains. We can't know. I looked back at him again. Don't you believe in any kind of spirituality? He laughed. If a God exists, he must be an exceedingly cruel monster of a God. There couldn't be a spiritual reality operating here. How could there be? Look at the world. What kind of God would design such a devastating place where children die horribly by earthquakes and senseless crimes and starvation when restaurants toss out tons of food every day? Although, he added, perhaps that's the way it's supposed to be. Perhaps that's God's plan. Maybe the end times scholars are correct. They think life and history is all just a test of faith to see who will win salvation and who won't, a divine plan to destroy civilization in order to separate the believers from the wicked. He attempted a smile, but it quickly faded as he drifted into his own thoughts. Finally, he quickened his pace. We were entering the sage meadow again, and I could see the crow tree a quarter of a mile away. Do you know what these end times people really are saying believe is happening? I did a study of them several years ago. They're fascinating. Not really, I said, nodding for him to go on. They study the prophecies hidden in the Bible, especially in the book of Revelations. They believe that we live in what they call the last days, the time when all the prophecies will come true. Essentially what they think is this. History is now set up for the return of the Christ and the creation of the heavenly kingdom on earth. But before this can occur, the earth has to suffer a series of wars, natural disasters, and other apocalyptic events predicted in the scriptures. And they know every one of these predictions, so they spend their time watching world events very closely, waiting for the next event on the timetable. What's the next event? I asked. A peace treaty in the Middle East that will allow the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Sometime after that, according to them, a massive rapture will begin among true believers, whoever they are, and they will be snatched off the face of the earth and lifted into heaven. I stopped and looked at him. They think these people will begin to disappear. Yeah, that's in the Bible. Then comes the tribulation, which is a 7-year period when all hell breaks loose for whoever is left on earth. Apparently, everything is expected to fall apart. And then a politician emerges, probably in Europe, who offers a plan to pull things back together, if, of course, he's set up with supreme power. This Antichrist at first protects Israel and facilitates a peace treaty. Then attacks later, starting a world war that ultimately involves the Islamic nations, including Russia, and finally China. According to the prophecies, just as Israel is about to fall, the angels of God swoop down and win the war, installing a spiritual utopia that lasts 1,000 years. He cleared his throat. Walk through a religious bookstore sometime and look around. There are commentaries and novels about these prophecies everywhere, and more coming out all the time. Do you think these end-time scholars are correct? He shook his head. I don't think so. The only prophecy that's being played out in this world is man's greed and corruption. We stopped and drank some water from my canteen. 50 yards ahead was the crow tree. I perked up. Far in the background, I could detect the faint dissonance of the hum. Joel's eyes squinted in concentration, watching me closely. What are you hearing? I turned around and faced him. It's a strange noise, a hum we've been perceiving. I think it may be some kind of an experiment going on in the valley. I haven't heard anything about that. What kind of experiment? Who's conducting it? I was about to tell him more when we were interrupted by another sound. We listened carefully. That's a vehicle, I said. 2 more gray jeeps were approaching from the west and heading toward us. We ran behind a patch of tall briars and hid, and they passed within 100 yards without stopping, heading southeast along the same path the earlier jeep had followed. I don't like this, Joel said. Who was that? Well, it's not the Forest Service, and no one else is supposed to be driving in here. I think it must be the people involved with the experiment." He looked horrified. "If you want," I said, "you can take a more direct route back to town. Just head southwest toward that ridge in the distance. You'll run into the stream after about 3/4 of a mile, and you can follow it west into town from there. I think you can arrive before it gets too dark." "You're not coming?" "Not now. I'm going directly south to the stream and wait a while for my friend." He tensed his forehead. "These people couldn't be conducting an experiment without someone in the Forest Service knowing about it." "I know." "You don't think you can do anything about this, do you? This is something big." I didn't respond. A pang of anxiety rushed through me. He listened for a moment and then moved past me into the valley, walking quickly. He looked back once and shook his head. I watched him walk until he crossed the meadow and disappeared into the forest on the other side. I hurriedly walked toward the south, thinking again of Charlene. What had she been doing out here? Where was she going? I had no answers. Pushing hard, I reached the stream in about 30 minutes. The sun was now completely hidden by a band of clouds at the western horizon, and the twilight cast the woods in ominous gray tones. I was tired and dirty, and I knew that listening to Joel and seeing the jeeps had affected my mood severely. Perhaps I had enough evidence now to go to the authorities. Perhaps that was the way I could help Charlene most. Several options danced through my head, all rationalizing my return to town. Because the woods on both sides of the stream were thin, I decided to wade across and make my way into the thicker forest on the other side, although I knew that area was private property. Once across, I stopped abruptly, hearing another jeep, then broke into a run. 50 feet ahead, the lane rose quickly into a knob of boulders and outcroppings, 20 feet high. Climbing quickly, I reached the top and accelerated my pace, then leaped upon a pile of large rocks, intending to jump them quickly to the other side. When my foot hit the topmost rock, the huge stone rolled forward, throwing my feet out from under me and starting the whole pile moving forward. I bounced once on my hip and landed in a small gully, the pile still tumbling my way. Several of the stones, each 2 or 3 feet in diameter, were careening down, coming squarely for my chest. I had time only to roll on my left side and raise my arms, but I knew I could not get out of the way in time. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a wispy movement of white in front of my face. Simultaneously, an unusual knowing came over me that the huge rocks would somehow miss. I heard them crash on both sides. Slowly, I opened my eyes and peered out through the dust, wiping the dirt and rock chips from my face. The rocks were lying neatly beside me. How had that happened? What was that white form? At the rising sound of the approaching vehicle, I jumped to my feet and ran several more steps before landing awkwardly on another rock. A bolt of throbbing pain raced through my whole leg as my left foot gave way. I fell to the ground and crawled the last 2 yards into the trees. I rolled around behind a huge oak as the vehicle pulled up to the stream, slowed for a few minutes, then raced away, again toward the southeast. My heart pounding, I sat up and pulled off my boot to inspect the ankle. It was already beginning to swell. Why this? I thought. As I slid around to stretch out my leg, I observed a woman staring at me from about 30 feet away. I froze as she walked toward me. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice concerned but wary. She was a tall black woman, perhaps 40, dressed in loose-fitting sweat clothes and tennis shoes. At her temples, strands of dark hair had pulled out of her ponytail and dangled in the breeze above her temples. In her hand was a small green knapsack. "I was sitting over there and saw you fall," she said. "It's your lucky day. I'm a doctor. Do you want me to take a look?" "I'd appreciate that," I said, dizzily. She knelt down beside me and moved the foot gently, at the same time surveying the area toward the creek. "Are you out here alone?" I told her briefly about looking for Charlene, but left out everything else. She said she had seen no one of that description. As she talked, finally introducing herself as Maya Ponder, I became convinced that she was completely trustworthy. I told her my name and where I lived. When I finished, she said, "I'm from Asheville, although I have a health center with a partner a few miles south of here. It's new. We also own 40 acres of the valley right here that joins the national forest." She pointed to the area where we were sitting, and another 40 acres up the ridge to the south. I unzipped a pocket in my hiking pack and pulled out my canteen. "Would you like some water?" I asked. "No, thanks, I have some." She reached inside her own pack, retrieved a canteen, and opened the top. But instead of drinking, she soaked a small towel and wrapped my foot, an action that made me grimace in pain. Turning and looking into my eyes, she said, "You've definitely sprained this ankle." "How badly?" I asked. She hesitated. "What do you think?" "I don't know. Let me try to walk on it." I attempted to stand, but she stopped me. "Wait a minute," she said. "Before you try to walk, analyze your attitude. How badly do you think you're hurt?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that very often your recuperation time depends on what you think, not me." I looked down at the ankle. "I think it could be pretty bad. If it is, I'll have to get back to town somehow." "What then?" I don't know. If I can't walk, I may have to go find someone else to look for Charlene." "Do you have any idea why this accident happened now?" "Not really." "Well, what does that matter?" "Because, again, very often your attitude about why an accident or illness has happened has an effect on your recuperation." "What kind of a doctor are you?" I asked. She smiled, and for the first time I saw her energy lift. She had decided to trust me, too. "Permit me to tell you about the kind of medicine I practice," she said. "Medicine is changing, and changing rapidly. We don't think of the body as a machine anymore, with parts that eventually wear out and have to be fixed or replaced. We're beginning to understand that the health of the body is determined to a great degree by our mental processes. What we think of life, and especially of ourselves, both at the conscious and unconscious levels. Adopting a positive outlook is very important in staying healthy, but we have to engage in this attitude in full awareness, using love for this attitude to be completely effective. What I believe is that our unspoken fears create blocks or crimps in the body's energy flow, and it's these blocks that ultimately result in problems. The fears keep manifesting in ever greater degrees until we deal with them. Physical problems are the last step. Ideally, these blocks would be dealt with early, in a preventive way, before illness develops." "So you think all illness can ultimately be prevented or cured?" "Yes, I'm sure we will have longer or shorter lifespans. That's probably up to the Creator. But we don't have to be sick. And we don't have to be the victims of so many accidents." "Well, do you think this applies to an accident like my sprain, as well as to illnesses?" She smiled. "Yes, in many cases." I was confused. "Look, I don't have time for this right now. I'm really worried about my friend. I've got to do something." "I know, but I have a hunch this conversation won't take long. If you rush by and disregard what I'm saying, you may miss the meaning of what is obviously quite a coincidence here." She looked at me to see whether I had picked up on her reference to the manuscript. "You're aware of the insights?" I asked. She nodded. "Well, what exactly do you suggest I do?" "Well, the technique I've had great success with is this. First, we try to remember the nature of your thoughts just prior to the health problem, in your case, the sprain. What were you thinking? What is the fear this problem is revealing to you?" I thought for a moment, then said, "I felt afraid, ambivalent. The situation here in this valley seemed much more sinister than I thought. I didn't feel as though I could handle it. On the other hand, I knew Charlene might need help. I was confused and torn over what to do." So, you sprained your ankle. I leaned toward her. Are you saying that I sabotaged myself so I wouldn't have to take action? Isn't that too simple? That's for you to say, not for me. But very often it is simple. Besides, the most important thing is not to spend time defending or proving. Just play with it. Try to remember everything you can about where the health problem came from. Explore for yourself. How do I do that? You have to calm your mind and receive this information intuitively, prayerfully, however you conceive the process. I resisted again, not sure whether I could relax and clear my mind. Finally, I closed my eyes, and for a moment my thoughts ceased. But then a succession of memories of Will and the day's events intruded. I let them go by and cleared my mind again. Immediately I saw a scene of myself at age 10, limping away from a touch football game, well aware that I was faking the injury. That's right, I thought. I used to fake sprains to avoid having to perform under pressure. I had forgotten all about this. I realized that later I began to actually hurt the ankle frequently, in all kinds of situations. As I pondered the memory, another flash of recollection entered my mind. A cloudy scene of myself in another time, feeling cocky, confident, impulsive. Then, as I worked in a dark, candlelit room, the door crashed in, and I was dragged away in terror. I opened my eyes and looked at Maya. Maybe I have something. I shared the content of my childhood memory, but the other vision felt too vague to be described, so I didn't mention it. Afterward, Maya asked, "What do you think?" I don't know. The sprain seemed the result of pure chance. It's hard to imagine that the accident came from this need to avoid the situation. Besides, I've been in worse situations than this many times, and I didn't sprain the ankle. Why did it happen now? She looked thoughtful. Who knows? Perhaps now is the time to see through the habit. Accidents, illness, healing, they're all more mysterious than any of us ever imagined. I believe that we have an undiscovered ability to influence what happens to us in the future, including whether we are healthy, although, again, the power has to remain with the individual patient. She paused and poured more water on the towel around my ankle, then continued. I believe the first step in the process is to identify the fear with which the medical problem seems to be connected. This opens up the energy block in your body to conscious healing. The next step is to pull in as much energy as possible and focus it at the exact location of the block. I was about to ask how this was done, but she stopped me. Go ahead and raise your energy level as much as you can. Accepting her guidance, I began to observe the beauty around me and to concentrate on a spiritual connection within, evoking a heightened sensation of love. Gradually, the colors became more vivid, and everything in my awareness increased in presence. I could tell that she was raising her own energy at the same time. When I felt as though my vibration had increased as much as possible, I looked at her. She smiled back at me. Okay, now you can focus the energy on the block. How do I do that? I asked. You use the pain. That's why it's there, to help you focus. How badly does it hurt right now? It's a throbbing ache, but not too bad. She unwrapped the towel. Focus your attention on the pain and try to feel it as much as possible. Determine its exact location. I know where it is. It's in the ankle. Yes, but the ankle is a large area. Where exactly? I studied the throbbing. She was correct. I had been generalizing the pain to the whole ankle, but as my leg was stretched out with the toes of my foot pointed upward, the pain was more precisely centered in the top left portion of this joint, and about an inch inward. Okay, I said. I've got that. Now, place all your attention on that specific area. Be there with all of your being. For a few minutes I said nothing. With total concentration, I felt this location in my ankle completely. I noticed that all the other perceptions of my body, breathing, the location of my hands and arms, sticky sweat on the back of my neck, faded far into the background. "What's happening with the pain?" she asked. "It's still there, but it has changed in character or something. It's becoming warmer, less bothersome, more like a tingling." As I talked, the pain began to take on its normal sensation again. "What's happened?" I asked. "I believe that pain serves another function beyond just telling us that something is wrong. Perhaps it also points out exactly where the difficulty is, so that we can follow it into our bodies like a beacon and place our attention and energy in exactly the right spot. It's almost as if both the pain and our concentrated attention can't occupy the same space. Of course, in cases of severe pain where concentration is impossible, we can use anesthetics to ease the intensity, although I think it's best to leave some pain so that the beacon effect can be utilized." She paused and looked at me. "What's next?" I asked.